There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I'm trying to hold my head just so that you don't see the glare from my spotlight. But anyway, I've had a fantastic reading week and an interesting week otherwise. Particularly yesterday, my biblio-adventure was meeting Karin Melberg Schwier, the author of my top read of last year, Small Reckonings. She lives in Saskatoon, and we met for lunch, and we had a marvelous conversation. And then we went to the bookstore. Actually, then we went to the bougie paper stationery store. As I have mentioned, have started journaling again, and I'm doing it by handwriting. I sometimes type on the computer, but there's a certain je ne sais quoi about handwriting. It's just that much more visceral. And my eccentricity about that is that I use felt pens, and it must be a different color from one day to the next. I don't mean a different color every day of the year, but I want to see where one journal entry ends and the other one starts at a glance. So I have not been able to find a green felt pen that looks good on the pages. There's something about the glossiness of the note paper inside that the green just doesn't look good. All the other colors are fine. So I bought 2 more green pens there, and they were pretty expensive. And they're not much better, so I'm just going to have to give up until I get onto another volume of my journal. But I digress. Having such a long literary chat with Karin was just a dream. Oh my God, I hope we get to do that again and again. So, without further ado, I've finished 3 books, and I'm not really going to check in on any of the ones that I've started, but I am going to check in about a short story that knocked my socks off, and I'll be starting, I believe, 2, and then we'll have a book haul. And to characterize my reading week, before I jump in, 2 of these books, I was barely at the halfway point by the time I posted my Friday reads around noon on Friday, and one of them I had to have finished for my Patreon book club at 2 p.m. Saturday, and the other one, which was much longer, I had to have finished for a 6 p.m. Zoom book club chat on Sunday. And I finished them, but oh my God, was that a reading marathon. And then I finished the one I was reading to Mum, so I'm going to tell you about those 3. But after that, I decided I'm not going to kill myself to finish anything, and I've done very little reading. I've been working on other things, BookTube-wise or whatever, and I just haven't tried to read too much since then. So that's why I'm not going to check in on any of the books that I started last week, even though I'm enjoying all of them. I think there's 3 of them. So stay tuned for that later. All right, with that being said, our Patreon book club talked about this one on Saturday, and this is the Sudanese novel, A Mouthful of Salt, by Reem Gaafar. It is not translated. She wrote it in English. She is a doctor and medical researcher based in Ontario somewhere. She has written, I think, prize-winning short stories, and this is her first novel. She was my mystery guest. I'll put a link to that. And I think it was pretty much unanimous. I think we all loved this. I sure loved it. It is set in a small village in North Sudan on the River Nile, and it opens as a boy has drowned, and they're scouring, trying to find his body. And he is the son and, more importantly, grandson of a very rich family in the town, and so they're making an extra effort. But Reem Gaafar situates that within the context of how many drownings there are, and how often they all have to go diving and swimming, and they actually get what are they called? Editing, Sean, here. I mangled this part of the description of what these big boats would do, so I've gone back to look it up to tell you very clearly and very briefly that what I was trying to say was that they would contract with tugboats that were nearby in towns down the river or whatever. And if they weren't busy, they would come, and I'm basically now reading from page 10 of the book, their powerful engines would churn the water and agitate the river floor, and that would quite often bring up the body from the bottom. So it's just this common thing that they all have lived with ever since they can remember. And then from there, more and more tragic things befall the village, members of the community. Our main character is a young woman whose name is Fatima, and her younger brother had died from drowning just a few years before, so it brings up all the wounds of that. And her best friend is getting married, and then suddenly a whole bunch of catastrophes happen in rapid succession. It's almost not believable, but it's so well done that you don't even really care. It does feel like this is believable, that this would happen and this would happen and this would happen. Meanwhile, we get into the backstories of so many of the women in the town, and boy, does Reem Jaffar make those women come alive. Oh, my goodness. And in particular, the middle half of the book is concerned with a woman who is from the south of Sudan, but marries a man from the north. They meet in Khartoum, and she is, without giving anything away, she is ostracized like you wouldn't believe by the residents of this small village. And we go into all of her backstory, which is almost like a standalone novel embedded within. There is lots about the legacy of colonialism, the way that the British colonizers split north and south and made it so that they couldn't have much to do with each other, and then now we're left with the situation that we have today. And that's all woven through it with a light touch. I can't wait to see what Reem Jaffar does next, and go have a look at the Mr. Guest chat I had with her, because what a fascinating writer she is. Now for something completely different. There's this group of readers. We've been reading Edith Wharton's fiction, and now just finished reading her memoirs, her autobiography. And I was talking with Chris of the Book Cougars, who's part of that group, about we should come up with a name for ourselves. And I think the Wharton Ramblers is being tossed around, but we haven't talked to the men in the group. It's only the girls. Chris and I thought that might be a good moniker. What do you think? The Wharton Ramblers? I suggested something like the Edith Warthogs, but Chris rolled her eyes at that. Anyway, we read her, I think it's about a 1934 memoir, A Backward Glance. It's a big, chunky book. Reads so easily. It's about 370 pages. It's breezy. It's really easy to read. I had so much of it left to read even when I got up Sunday morning, like I'm almost half left. And it was just a book you can just fall into and turn the pages, and it's really vivid in a certain way. Some people in the discussion thought she withheld too much, but I think that's just a product of the times. Like, she got divorced. She doesn't mention that. She writes about her husband, then he kind of disappears for several hundred pages, and then there's a paragraph about his death, but she doesn't mention that they were divorced or anything about the marital problems, but autobiographies didn't in those days. So many things I found rich. I loved her talking about New York and comparing it to Boston and talking about how it's changed over the years. And I've read a lot of the fiction that is set there, but to hear her talk about it in terms of how she experienced it, and about her family, and about starting to write. The first book she wrote was on interior decorating. No, not in decorating, but interior design, and it was a bestseller. And then she tried her hand at fiction after that. She was a woman whose life, as much as it was a life of writing, was a life of friendships, and she writes beautifully about her friends. I hate reading Henry James, but I loved reading her portrait of Henry James. It's probably almost 100 pages of the book. And what a nuanced portrait. And her critique of his fiction, which I agree with heartily. I would go farther than she did. But that was a delight. She also talked about the years she lived in Paris and about being part of the literary salons in Paris. And the description of that was like a novel. Just so much fascinating stuff. Oh, darn. I was sure I had marked it, and I didn't. So I'm just going to tell you about it. But I got to find it because it's one of my favorite things in the memoirs. She talked about how Henry James talked just like he wrote. These long, spindly sentences and never coming directly to the point. For better and for worse. But one time they were driving somewhere, and apparently Henry James was never more comfortable than when he was being motored around England or wherever. And they got lost, and they pulled over to the side of the road. I don't know who was driving. I don't think it was Henry James, but Henry James leaned out the window because there was an old man walking down the road, and they wanted him to ask how to get to such and such mansion or whatever the place they were visiting, museum or whatever, out in the countryside. He spoke in these loopy, spidery paragraphs. The old man had no idea what he didn't even come to a question. And finally, maybe it was Edith Wharton or somebody in the back said, "We want to know where Dunn Street is." And the old man said, "You're on it." Henry James could not bring himself to pose a simple question, though that's Henry James in a nutshell. So much else to be said about this. I think Chris and I in the group were the most enthusiastic about it, but It's just full of anecdote and character sketches and just a portrait of a time in history that I don't know how you would access it any more vividly in any other way. Just loved this. And the last one that I finished this week was this book that I read to Mum, and boy did we love it. This is a really important, satisfying, resonant novel. It is by the Canadian writer Dora Dueck, and it's called All That Belongs. I had a mystery guest chat with her about a year ago exactly, or it was posted about a year ago, and I've now read this to Mum. Oh, I had no idea what to expect. I'd never read anything by Dora Dueck, and boy, what a shapely, and I'm going to repeat myself, resonant novel. It's about an older woman. She's not elderly. She's 65 maybe, and she's just retired as an archivist. And her husband is he's in music. What is he? He conducts, but he's a choir director and maybe even a professor of music. But music is his whole life. And he's supposed to be retired, but he can't quite let go. So he accepts another 6-month contract. And so she's retired with not that much to do. And she has spent her whole life archiving history, preserving history. But suddenly her own family history comes front and center in her life because what is she going to do? Her elderly mother's in the old folks home down the road, and her husband's still busy. They don't have kids, which becomes a big part of the story in a certain way. And so she goes on a journey, and she asks her mother about stuff, the part of her childhood that she has so many questions about. There's really two, but the first one is her uncle, who they called Uncle Must. There's a cute explanation for why she and her brother called him Uncle Must, but he farmed with their dad in Alberta. The story jumps around, but I believe that the farm was in Alberta. Uncle Must never married, and he was very reserved, very conservative, strong, silent type. Quite moralistic, but so silent that you didn't necessarily know how he felt, other than the look on his face. He was definitely very close with their dad, but he was just weird. And as she starts to remember some of the bizarre things about him, it just becomes this mystery, and it's not a mystery. But there is a mystery that she's trying to solve. There might be a certain kind of reader that would think it wasn't pacey enough. I thought it was absolutely the right pace because she's really ruminating on the things and more memories are coming up, and we get flashback scenes that are fully half, if not more, of the novel, and all of those characters just jump off the page. Uncle Must is enigmatic. Really behind it, and ultimately of greater significance, is the story of her brother because he died young. And I'm not going to say any more about that, but there's a parallel journey she goes on, trying to figure out what really happened to him and how she feels about it all these years later. And these two men from her family have been haunting her, and she's now at the right place to start to make some connections and come to some conclusions or integrate all that into who she is in the present moment. I thought it was glorious. It was so rich, and there's a lot. They're a Mennonite family, and there's not Mennonite church history in it particularly, but there's history of the Mennonite families going back into the States, and another strand going back into Russia, which is where a lot of the juice of the story, the original family incidents that triggered a lot of stuff in the succeeding generations happened, and that she uncovers. And oh my God, it's so good. I'm going to be interviewing Dora Dueck about this on the weekend, and it'll be months later when you see the interview, but this was such a Sean book and such a Sean's mum book that I can't wait to read more. Dora Dueck has written all kinds of other books, and she has a short story collection coming out in the spring, and I'm hoping that I will be able to interview her about that in advance, and that maybe there might even be a Saskatoon book launch that I can interview her for. We'll see. So, that's what I finished. I explained why I'm not going to talk about any of the books I started, even though I liked them. I just didn't read more than about 10 or 15 pages of any of them. But I do want to tell you about the incredible short story I read today. This book is turning out to be, there have been one or two misses, for sure. Only one maybe so far. In this anthology, A Different Sound, stories by mid-century women writers, selected and introduced by Lucy Scholes. This is a buddy read with Joe Smith. This week's story is by Stella Gibbons. She's the author of Cold Comfort Farm, which I've not read. And this is her short story called Listen to the Magnolias. And it's also set in the war, not in London, but in a maybe smaller city or town. It's about a widow, and she's emotionally fragile. Her husband's died, and she's never hardly done anything really since he died, however many years ago. She had one maid with her for 20 years that she loved, and then that woman, she went off to be a cook in the war, and her new maid is not nearly as good, but that's her whole world. She and her part-time maid, and then she is told on no uncertain terms that because she lives in a 4-bedroom house and she's living there alone, that she has to billet 5 American soldiers, and she just almost has a nervous breakdown about it. All her images of what an American soldier might be, and even her fear of men in general, other than her late husband, just torment her. And then it reaches such a beautiful conclusion in the very last paragraph. It's one of the best stories I've read this year for sure. I was going to check. Let's see if you can find it online. Oh, I'm so delighted. There is a podcast, or I don't know if it's a podcast or just a YouTube channel called Classic Stories, and they have an audio version of it. There's no video. It's just a picture, I think, of Stella Gibbons. But it's well read. I just listened to a minute of it. So if you can't find it anywhere else, listen to it. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's just such a lovely story. All right. I'm going to be starting 2 books. I always try to do something for Black History Month, read some Black literature or nonfiction, and I'm overcommitted. I'm not going to do anything other than, unless I might fit another audiobook in later this month. But what I am doing for sure, and probably only this one, is a collection of short stories. And this is going to be a buddy read with one of my patrons, and probably my most faithful commenter. I think he hasn't missed commenting on one video since I started, or since he's been watching me, which is almost from the time I started, Paul. And we're going to do a couple buddy reads in a row here, both of books that have been reissued by the McNally, what do they call themselves? McNally editions. And this one is a collection of African-American short stories. Look at that cover. Loverman by Alston Anderson. I've scanned through the afterword, which is by somebody I've never heard of, who is definitely Japanese or Japanese-American, Kinohi Nishikawa, who talks about the way that this was marketed when it first came out in 1959 to appeal to white readers, not only black readers, and it didn't particularly appeal to either. And so it dropped into obscurity, and I don't know that Alston Anderson, I'd never heard of him. Let's see. His dates are 1924 to 2008, so not that far back in the past. He was born in Panama to Jamaican parents and came to North Carolina as a child. He was friends with Robert Graves, and I think Robert Graves wrote an introduction to this collection when it was first published in an attempt to introduce it to a white readership, but it wasn't necessarily successful. But apparently the stories are incredible and do stand the test of time. The kind of stories he's telling were inspired by bebop, which he loved, and the philosophy he studied at the Sorbonne, capturing the inner lives of black boys and men in the early 1940s. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And this is one of the chunksters I'm going to be tackling in 2026, and that is this Dutch novel in translation, The Remembered Soldier by Anjet. It's translated from the Dutch by David McKay, and look what a chunkster this is, and it's supposed to be amazing. It was published in the Netherlands 2019, and this is the 2025 translation. And it is 560 pages, and this is going to be a buddy read with my patron, big supporter of this channel, Alina, who lives in Rotterdam. Do we need to know any more about what it's about? It's about a remembered soldier. It's set in Flanders, 1922. And it's about a soldier home from the Great War who lives in a psychiatric asylum. That's all I need to know. And I need to get a start on this because Alina, and I think we said August, I don't remember, but I'm going to need that much time. The slow poke way I like to read big books. So can't wait to dive into this. All right. Book haul time. Here is a book that I bought after doing it on audio. And I might have had the ebook on Scribd or something at the time, but it's a book that I loved so much that I just had to have a copy. So here it is. Love After Love by Ingrid Persaud. It's set in Trinidad. She's a Trinidadian writer. I did a full review of it at the time, which will be linked in the show notes. And I think Ingrid found that review. So that gave me a way to get in touch with her. And then I interviewed her about this novel. And that was one of my very first author interviews. Maybe Ronan Hession was the first one, and she was the second or something, but we had just an incredible conversation. And this is a book that's so near and dear to my heart that I needed it on my shelf. The story of a gay man who lives in Trinidad, Mr. Cheaton. He is lodging with a single mother and her son, Betty and Solo. And it's the story of the three of them. And definitely trigger warning for homophobic violence. Unforgettable characters and a really heartbreaking and beautiful story. I'm not reading from it because I would not do justice to the dialogue. But what I do recommend heartily, you could do it without benefit of the book because Ingrid narrates the audiobook magically. So you want to hear all this dialogue and this entire story in her voice if audiobooks float your boat. Next is a Palestinian novel that quite a few of you already know about. It's called The Book of Disappearance by Ibtisam Azem. And it's translated from the Arabic by Sinan Antoun, who is an Iraqi writer. I've read one of his novels. I bought it immediately after one of my mystery guests, Noreen Masood, recommended it so passionately. But now that it's been here for a couple of months, I think it's not one I'm eager to get to because it's a magically realist story, or a speculative, I guess would be more the word. The animating question of the novel is, what if all the Palestinians in Israel simply disappeared one day? What would happen next? How would Israelis react? These unsettling questions are posed in this powerfully imaginative novel, and I'm not really interested in that kind of fiction, but anyway, maybe I'll get to it one of these days. Maybe you'll tell me I absolutely must, and you'll tell me why, and you'll convince me. Opening a few lines from chapter 1. My mother put on mismatched shoes and ran out of the house. Her curly hair was tied back with a black band. The edge of her white shirt hung over her gray skirt. Fear inhabited her face, making her blue eyes seem bigger. She looked like a mad woman as she roamed the streets of Ajami, searching for my grandmother, rushing as if trying to catch up with herself. I followed her out. When she heard my footsteps, she looked back and gestured with her broomstick-thin arm. Go back. Stay home. Maybe she'll come back. But Baba is there. Then go to her house, and then to Alston Square. Look for her there. She went frantically from house to house. So tense, she looked like a lost ant, knocking on doors so hard I was afraid she'd break her hand, as if her fist was not flesh and bones, but more like a hammer. She didn't greet whoever came out, and just asked right away if they'd seen my grandmother. If no one answered, she'd take a deep breath and weep before the closed door. Then she'd go on to the next house, wiping her tears away with her sleeves. And here is a cover by. I don't do cover bys very much, but on some best of lists I saw reference to this American novel. Never heard of it and had never heard of the author. Loved the cover so much that with barely another bit of investigation I bought it. It was originally published in 1972 and is brought back out by a publisher I've never heard of called Hagfish. Oh my goodness. Look at this cover. To Smithereens by Rosalind Drexler. I gotta hold it just the right way so you can see the print. That cover. And I think it's pretty wacky, so I don't know if I'm gonna like it, but I'm sure gonna try it. The author was born in 1926 in the Bronx. She was a sculptor, then she became a painter, and apparently was very successful in both. And she also wrote 9 novels and 4 screenplays, so a Renaissance woman, to be sure. The protagonist, Rosa, is unemployed, single, and broke. Gets through her days with Dexedrine, sugar cubes, and the I-Ching in her handbag. Then she meets Paul, a middling art critic. These opening 3 paragraphs make me think, oh, this is going to be a wacky book. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe not. I don't know. But here it is. About a year ago, I was depressed, and I didn't have any place to go. But you know, there's always some place to go in New York. Like the NBC tours, the UN, or the movies. It was mid-afternoon. The afternoon is for very on-hip places. But I was really so depressed that I thought I'd hide out in the movies. The picture didn't help. A huge, mutilated corpse in Technicolor lay bleeding into an oriental rug. His missing parts were being enumerated by a detective, almost seductively, to a younger member of the police force. Penis, cut off. I brought a non-carbonated drink to my seat just as the detective was examining some sand on the floor of the dead bachelor's digs. His eyes seemed foamy and pale yellow as he rose, but adjusted to piercing blue as he said, sand. That is intriguing. Has anybody out there read this? And the last one is a New Saskatchewan novel. I don't think it's set in Saskatchewan, but the writer is. It's fairly hot off the press. The Chorus Beneath Our Feet by Melanie Schnell. Came out at the end of 2025 from Radiant Press. And it is also about... I can't find any information about what war the man has come home from. I've scanned what few reviews there are on Goodreads, and the synopsis doesn't say, but I'll find out eventually. But that's the premise. After he gets home, his mute sister Mary goes missing. And there's a whole bunch of other plot that's mentioned on the back cover. I will read the first 2 paragraphs from chapter 1. A warm draught of mildew and beer greets Jess as he walks into Max's bar. The old pub still looks and smells the same, and Jess finds this depressing as hell. Even with everything he's witnessed on the other side of the world, all that horror, he can't get the images out of his head. The worst, of course, is what happened just last week. Nate running toward him on the rocky path. Nate's body in his arms. A heavy, bloody, broken rag doll. And yet, after all this time, after all the shit, home is still the same. Nothing here changes or moves forward, despite Jess walking through the door a new man. Short of breath, a patch over one blinded eye. A good 20 pounds lighter than when he left. And now, with these new memories that rush in, making him pour with sweat. He hasn't slept a solid hour since 8 days prior, when Nate died. The chronics at the bar look like the same ones from when Jess was last here, their bodies curled over their warm pints in the shapes of battered letter C's. A fugitive image rushes in of his dad slouched over the bar on one of these stools, his face turned sideways, slack cheeks like melting clay, pooling onto the surface, mouth open and drooling. With his heart in his throat, Jess steps closer to see whether he knows any of them, but jolts back at the sound of his name. Sharp pinpricks of sweat irritate his armpits. He turns to the voice. All right, that's my book haul, and that's my Friday Reads. Thank you for watching.